So marketing has always had a foundational role at O2. We like to say that we are a brand that runs a business, not a business with a brand. And I have to say we are blessed with a CEO who, even as an ex-CFO, is extremely marketing literate. We've always had the customer at the heart of the O2 brand, but our organisation is on a transformational journey to be truly customer-led, and that has been driven by marketing. To take that role, we've had to evolve and change, and learning to develop the marketing effectiveness discipline has been part of that. Proving the tangible value, not only of the brand and marketing communications, that we also often talk about as marketing, but also customer experience and our value propositions that we put to our customers. Proving that tangible value becomes increasingly important when you're trying to take the organisation with you. The role for marketing effectiveness is to provide an objective and evidenced view on what is working, what isn't, and what we should do differently. In our organisation, we sit close enough to our marketing colleagues to understand and influence, but it's important that we maintain our objectivity. We can call on a wide range of data sources. I think somebody was referencing the telecoms data that we have earlier. We are blessed with a plethora of data, often too much. On top of our internal analytics, we have social media, research, and a lot of qualitative feedback as well that we can use to tell a complete story about the success of our marketing plans and our failures on occasion. The KPIs that we measure and the language that we use is critical to our success in influencing the organisation and taking them on the transformation journey with us. Our marketing effectiveness journey started around 3 years ago. We're looking to create a learning culture, and in essence, as a marketing effectiveness function within a greater customer insight and experience function, we are learning ourselves as we go along, as we create this new capability. We are constantly evolving what we do. We've built capability in econometrics. We look at quarterly reviews. We've had great success with those. We're setting KPIs. But while embedding that learning into the organisation, we're looking for the next thing. Where's the next place we can influence? Where's the next big challenge? Being part of the IPA EffWeek Advisory Board is hugely important to us. We actively support the development of effectiveness as a discipline. We found that recruitment is a challenge. There are very few people who are really up to speed with what's happening in this area. It's great to see more and more people taking this on in their job role, in their job title. But we know that as a discipline, we need to develop this behaviour, and the more we learn together, the better we all get. We know that as we go through and go into the future, that there are 2 time frames here. We've heard it referenced earlier. We need to know not only about the short-term tactical decisions, but also we need to learn about the long-term brand and organisational health. We need to create this learning culture so that we are looking at both. We're not just reacting to the short term, but that we're also building for the long term, building our plans back into our future strategies, into our 3-year planning process. And it's really important to bear in mind those 2 time frames and not just be stuck in the tactical. Learning to keep these 2 in balance is a critical role for us, and to make sure that the organisation stays in equilibrium is a tough challenge. So we're delighted to have sponsored this project. Fran's work is really timely. It presents us with a model for culture change and leadership within the organisation. Learning together from the best of the best will benefit us all. We're grateful to the IPA and associated EffWeek partners for the opportunity to develop this marketing effectiveness discipline as we go into the future. Thank you, Fran.
Thanks, Jessica. Okay, so my name is Fran Cassidy, and I'm going to take you through these research findings. So first of all, what did we want to establish? Well, clearly we wanted to find out how important effectiveness is now in organisations and what impact it's having on the culture of the brands and organisations that we interviewed, and therefore what the implications then were for brand and agency relationships. And critically, what were the key behaviours that made a more successful culture than the rest? We talked to around 20 brands and agencies as well, and we had a range of commercial and not-for-profit organisations as well. They probably amount to about £700 million worth of advertising expenditure, not necessarily marketing, but certainly advertising expenditure. And if you think about the business context that Martin and Paddy were talking about this morning, that sort of climate of cautious optimism at best is the environment in which they are, in which they're all working. Now, you've got an increased zero-based budgeting happening there. You've got more scenario planning, and that is increasingly forcing that focus into marketing accountability. Added to that, you have the availability of data and technical innovation. And you can see here from two quotes from the respondents. That first one talking about, the budget for marketing was as big as the capex, but it didn't have the rigor at that particular organisation that it needed to have. And that was what the increase in the focus was going to become on. And the second one there talking about the global mantra that had happened in their organisation across the world about marketing accountability and marketing effectiveness, massively dialed up in the last 2 years. In fact, by far, the majority of the sample, improving marketing effectiveness is now a business imperative. And in terms of defining what that means, we're really talking about making sense of the complexity of the landscape that they're working in and understanding what worked in delivery of the objective set. And I thought sort of what worked rather than thinking about the future. And I think the movement from this justifying expenditure to a learning culture that Jess was talking about is really, really important, and certainly was one of the differences of that successful cultures that we talked about before. Now, that increase in focus across the sample was certainly seen at least 3/4 of the sample. They had massively increased the resource or changed the marketing investment decision-making structures that were happening over the last 2 years. And in fact, a third had developed specialist effectiveness units, either within the marketing department, within Insight, we'll see in a moment, but these units are something new that has happened over the last 2 to 3 years. And that change actually has also been noted by some of the agencies that we spoke to. There you've got that first one talking about how that COO had seen that KPI culture move from something like 10% to up to 40% of their clients in the last couple of years. And that last one there about somebody who had only joined the company 2 years ago, there'd been really huge change in that time, and now they had got a new job in being in charge of marketing effectiveness. There's no real structure of a model structure as yet. I think it's still sort of too early to say. Marketing does still tend to be responsible for it, but it can sit in lots of different places. And in the report that you can take away today, we'll look at the strengths and weaknesses of each of those structures. But they did the successful ones did tend to have a direct input from finance in that process and in the model. The sample themselves, they really split into sort of 3 groups really. Group 1 was like a much more short-term focused, had some net promoter scores, some simple brand tracking, but it tended to be a review and report type process. Then there was sort of a group 2, which had a bit more sophisticated brand tracking, ROI, econometrics, MMM, and there was an understanding of the difference between short and long term. And there was also, in that particular group, a recognition that they needed to look forward and use the data to forward plan. And then the last group, I would say a smaller group than the other 2, had or in the middle of a complete data and insight system change. And some of them even had a solution that they felt had already worked or was going to work very, very well for them in the very short time frame, as in 2 years. In fact, I asked them how they thought they were progressing. If you look at those sort of group 1, 2 and 3, yes, I know this is a qualitative study, so I'm not looking about percentages here, but it's all of the brands, not surprisingly, they all think that they're progressing, but I asked them, okay, on a scale of 1 to 10, where were you 2, 3 years ago, where are you now, where are you likely to be? But it was the speed of that trajectory that they believed that they would really get somewhere in the next 2 to 3 years that was really very, very marked. And that sort of confidence was really surprising. So from the interviews that we did, we sort of identified sort of 5 real key behaviours that relate to success in marketing effectiveness culture. And those were these. So something to do related to language, process, an effective toolbox, having the capability, but throughout a sense of collaboration across the entire organisation. And I'll go through each of those in turn. So that first one, that collaboration. I do feel that in these successful marketing effectiveness cultures, there was starting to be a breakdown in silos. I mean, silos are more than lines and boxes. Silos are corrosive. If you don't want to share data, it can have a very corrosive effect on the organisation. And the more successful cultures were those that had started to break these down. There was joint decision making across the commercial, the marketing and the finance teams. Effectiveness was brought in, the effectiveness data was brought into strategic decision making, and there was a shift in the language, and I'll talk about language in a second. And what was interesting was, again, in those successful cultures, there was an understanding that brand health was really important, and it wasn't really a question of if it was going to pay back. The tension was actually when it was going to pay back. The finance directors wanted that immediately, and the marketing directors wanted to make sure that the future of the brand was secure. So these quotes here, the first one they're talking about that strategic director understanding the difference between the long-term future of the brand and the short-term nature. And that second one there is particularly interesting because he was talking about how it was marketing's role to try and introduce an understanding of the grey area, the greyness of that pervaded the organisation now. That they wanted yes or no answers, and there weren't any, and that's part of that sort of complication of the landscape that we were talking about before. So the next behaviour is language. It's been referred to several times this morning already. And they might use the same language, but the value was different inside and outside sometimes the marketing departments. So what we thought we really needed to strengthen the association of the terminology with marketing terminology with commercial value. And sometimes that phraseology was just too opaque. And the whole presentation is something again that was talked about this morning. The presentation of marketing, its needs, can really be improved to the marketing, to the finance department and to the C-suite. And that's partly driven by that collaborative decision making that was needed earlier. And if there was one key understanding piece missing from some of the financial, not necessarily financial directors, but certainly the financial analysts, was the value of brand health. I think there was a willingness to learn. Certainly in that group 1 and 2, there was a real need for more understanding of what brand health could bring. So that first one there is referring to this particular person believed that the financial outcome of brand campaign was impossible to understand. And then the finance director in that second one saying that they particularly didn't have any value ascribed to the brand equity stuff. So I think we've got some way to go in certain quarters. They just like certainty, and it comes back to that point I was making about the shades of grey that are now pervasive. Some people, in fact, have started to change the terminologies already. Martin talked about non-working media budgets. And in fact, in one organisation that referenced a non-working media budget, they've changed in their organisation to brand assets. So, asset creation, which is what they believe that really is something that reflects what that budget really does. It's creating the assets. And maybe there is some value in changing that phraseology, like the sort of soft metrics and brand halos that the sort of financial analysts and the financial managers find more difficult to understand. So maybe we should be moving to things like soft metrics to unlocking future growth, longer term spend to share protection. So the next behaviour was process. And obviously everybody had a process, but it's having integrity of the process that was important. What do I mean by that? Well, it means by putting effectiveness at the beginning of the process rather than at the end. Having a shared view of the customer, the priorities, what needs measuring, what data we are actually going to collect to actually find out whether anything's working. And having a consistency. Even in the international companies, they had trouble getting a consistency across the metrics, but is now understood as a big issue they're really trying to focus on so that they can compare effectiveness across markets. And aligning those metrics to the business needs. One really interesting example was an organisation that had, for a long time, had put their brand health metrics as an annual measure, something at the end. Whereas, in fact, what they needed to do was make sure that the brand health was at its peak when their most important product was being launched. So maybe phasing different targetings according to the business needs, not just what had been done before. And then lastly there, the importance of the finance department to help to pull together all of this process, pull together the finance. They are the process backbone very often of organisations, and the people that were doing that seemed to feel that that was really, really working for them. So talking about effectiveness being at the beginning of the process, got an interesting example here from a new briefing system by the Government Communications Service, which now not only forces quantified objectives, but if you look at that top there on the right-hand side, it actually asks them in the briefing process to put in the evidence of what they believe is going to be, or how the evidence they've got of whether this thing will work or not. And then even an expected ROI in the briefing form right at the beginning. And the interviewee that I spoke to about this said, yes, it is difficult, but it really forces the mind. It concentrates the team in what they're trying to do. And that planning aspect is something that came out again and again. So you have here this senior, and it's even in the title of this guy, it's the Senior Planning and Performance Manager. Again, that was referred to this morning as well. He had, his job now is just to focus on planning, getting the data into the planning process, allied to insight and the commercial team. They even talked about how it was like the lights had gone on. Suddenly the organisation realised that this was the best way to do it. And the second one, they're about the process of efficiency. The process is not the end point. The end point is the results. Process just makes you be efficient, but you need to have some integrity in it as well. Again, part of that process is the learning. Jess talked about the learning element of it, having a learning cycle. And it's moving again from that justification to that learning culture that we see in those successful organisations. And it's not about finding failure. Learning needs to be reframed about not finding failure. It's about making the organisation stronger, fitter, able to deliver its objectives in a much, much better way. And it means being really focused on the future rather than just looking at what's past. One of the respondents was really interesting, talked about how there was potentially just a different attitude to being measured that needed to be put into their particular organisation. And she likened it to having sort of a high-fibre cereal approach, like it was potentially going to be difficult to swallow, but it was really good for you in the end. So those learnings, and it was seen in this quote here, need not only to be found out, but to be adopted. And that particular organisation there had, that was the loop. The adjust element in their process was the bit that was missing. The learning bit, the adoption, needed to be taken forward. Number 4 on that list was Toolbox. Clearly, yes, there is much, much greater complexity in the data sets. But now those data sets are being integrated, they're being automated, and they're much, much more predictive. There's more econometrics, there's more modelling, and they're especially in the services area. Jess referred to about all those touch points, and it's much more complex for them. But one of the most important progressions is the inclusion of long-term brand health into centralised systems and models. And those successful organisations are starting to do that. Having confidence across the organisation. Remember, we were talking about collaborative decision making. Having confidence in the data set is critical. You can't move forward without that, because otherwise you just start arguing about the numbers, not what the numbers are helping you to decide what to do. So there's this reporting culture moving from a reporting culture to a so what, what's next. But two of the really concerning things that came up in all of the interviews was, one, there was no real reference at all, apart from one respondent who mentioned a metric about price elasticity. And we know how important that is. You look at the work done by Les and Peter, by Paddy. You know how important that is to profit. There's no mention of that. And also, going back to what Nigel was talking about before, no mention of craft, the quality of the message. And I'm not just talking about advertising here. I'm talking about customer services and all of those other areas of marketing. There was no real mention in the metric list about the quality of the message. It was much, much more about the pipes. And I think that is a concern. But what is encouraging is this use of brand health and customer experience data and integrating that into the strategic decision making of some of those really good examples of marketing effectiveness culture. And what it means is they can start to challenge the systems and the way things are done. There was one really interesting example of a guy who had been brought into an organisation and knew within 2 or 3 months that the way that they were doing things was wrong. But he said, I had to wait 2 years before I had the data to prove that what I thought was absolutely right, because it was only with that data set that I could actually move forward. And ask them, what metrics have you got then? And these are all in the report. We don't have to go through them, obviously. But yes, there was, you group the financial performance ones, brand-related ones, and in the service areas, many, many more. And as I said, there's more econometric modelling, MMM. Actually, not as much reference, if at all, to attribution modelling, which was quite interesting. But also, these KPIs, they do change. So up to 20 to 40% of them change every year. And that's really not that surprising if you think about how things are actually moving. But some organisations that had a data science team, one of them actually said that their ambition was to be obsolete in 3 years, because the data would be all pervasive in the organisation, everyone would have access to it, so that there would be no need for a data team anymore. I don't know whether that will actually materialise, but that was what they were particularly thinking at the time. So these data sets and the metrics I've talked about, they haven't really changed. There's nothing radically new on there, but what is happening is they're just being pulled together, just being brought together in those data sets I mentioned. And the second point here that I thought was particularly interesting was the reference to that, the equity, the tracking, and the MMM being pulled together, being called the crown jewels of the organisation. And it was that was presented to the C-suite. It was that was presented to the board. And he said, we don't show the ad anymore. This is the stuff that we show. And the key to that particular organisation was that they had 10 years of awareness data, 10 years of data on which to draw it from. Now, the last behaviour on this list was development of capability. I was interested to see, actually Baron Sharp mentioned that the great CMOs spend their time creating and developing marketing capability throughout the organisation. So it was about leadership and education, evaluation systems, processes and metrics. That was what the CMOs were concentrating on in terms of he was thinking. And yes, there is an increase in capability happening, but there is a fantastic, huge skill shortage. Jesh mentioned it before, particularly on the client side, I think. And yes, that sort of brand customer metric understanding is needed among the finance teams a bit more, but the marketing teams need that too. And that skills gap is going to be continuous because things change. They're going to be continually needed. And the other reason that development is going to be continually needed is because of staff churn. If you think about brand managers and marketing managers, they're only in the job 6 months, 12 months, and then there's a new one. So actually, I think there's a really important role for agencies potentially to be sort of the touchstone of what has worked traditionally for brands in the churn that's happening. Perhaps the most compelling evidence, though, is that in that successful group, in those organisations, the marketing people were bonused on brand health. There's probably no better example of what an organisation believes to be the future and the success of the organisation than that. So, I mean, all of these behaviours, they can't obviously guarantee that a marketing effectiveness culture can be created, but I certainly believe that they will be helpful to create it. So if these data sets are being controlled internally and there's a lot more internal organisation going on, what is the role of agencies in all of this? I particularly liked one of the strategic and innovation directors when they were talking about how the effectiveness for them felt like at the end of the journey, not the beginning. And they really talked about how sometimes in agencies, the strategy gets put in a box and given to the strategy director and saying, it's your job to prove that it's just worked. And so that, those sorts of practices can't happen anymore. But the good news is that clients do believe agencies can contribute in this. This particular person talked, especially if they knew the metrics that mattered. The real business performance levers from the organisation, and if the organisation doesn't know that themselves, then the agency can help them to understand that. But by focusing on those, they could really drive the business forward. And agencies can also provide that support because of the combination of brand planning and commercial nous that they can deliver. And in fact, if you think about what the industry stands for, we as of agency groups should be able to communicate the right message and influence positive behaviour to trigger a change in culture, because that's what we do for a living. So we should be able to do it for our own industry as well. So there's sort of 4 or 5 ideas here about how agencies could potentially change to help this whole process by putting effectiveness at the heart of day-to-day organisations, not running at the end. So I talked about how there are other people in the organisation that are having an effect on marketing investment. Maybe agencies should to reach out to those sorts of groups now. Find out the metrics that mattered, as I mentioned before, and ensure that is part of the brief. If applicable, then help the client change the lexicon, change the language that they're using so that it's understood across the organisation that they're working with, and improve that marketing story. And it's already happening, as we see week by week, that effectiveness-based contracts, but also effectiveness-based reviews. How many of the agencies have a review every 3 months to find out whether the work they're doing is delivering, at least at some point, or on track to deliver the effectiveness that the client is looking for. I also think that agencies can really keep the rigour of the strategic objective. Several talked about how at a pitch the strategic objective would be voiced very, very clearly, but as you get into the nitty-gritty of the briefs and day-to-day, things take over, and sometimes that gets dissipated and lost. But the agency can bring it back to what really mattered. So one thought that we had that may help this process is the development of a sort of 3-speed framework to help planning and reporting of marketing activity. So there could be something relating to now, something relating to 6 months activity that relates to 6 months to a year, and then 1 to 3 years, so that a balance can be borne in mind for every particular, each particular time frame, so that we don't lose sight of what we're trying to do. And in all of this, there is a powerful role, I think, for the IPA in all of this evolution to reflect the shift and changes of those behaviours. Yes, we can integrate into the culture and get all of this data into the culture and into business. We can pool the effectiveness knowledge. There is so much about what we know. But my call would be, it's not about being aware of this information, it's about usage. For example, how many of the account managers, and I know that share of voice and share of market is more difficult in digital environments, but how many of account managers understand the share of voice, share of market of the clients that they're working on? Yes, it will be important to keep on top of best practice. Developing that 3-speed framework. What's working? Does that work? Does it not work? How do we change it so that it does? And really to track the movement of effectiveness being at the end to at the beginning of the process. And we talked about capability, but it's building capability into agencies too. So this is about professional development. There's a huge opportunity to evolve the professional development of the industry. And it would be a helpful start point to pull together finance, analytics, marketing, agencies together and evolve that development, the development offer. And then marketing itself. It always sounds a weird phrase that, but it clearly is necessary for some organisations where there is that opaque element happening. So maybe developing some sort of project to report, to plan, how to plan and report on marketing and ask for needs. And we're delighted to have done this work with CIMA. I don't think we could have done it without them. And we're delighted to have Dr. Noel Tago here with us today, who is going to be helping the IPA to move forward with all of this information and developing some cross-functional professional development. So I talked a lot about process and collaboration and all of these sorts of things, but it's really more than this. It's about a mindset. And that's why we called this project Culture First, because it's developing the mindset so that these organisations will get stronger and fitter and able to deliver their objectives. The results of everything are in this fabulous tome, which are going to be given out at the end of today. And thank you very much indeed. I think we'll move on.